Mexico's loss, the $11 trillion engine that built America. The gold was in the pan before the ink was dry. 9 days before the treaty, Flex at Sutter's Mill said California wasn't a frontier, it was a fortune. Meanwhile, on a narrow strip between two rivers, 63 American dragoons rode into an ambush that would rewrite a continent. Here's the play. Nearly 40% of America's GDP now sits on land Mexico lost in 2 years. Was this a heist dressed as destiny? Polk needed American blood in a place nobody could define. To see how the machinery worked, we go back to a 150-mile band of sand and mesquite that both nations claimed and neither controlled. The disputed strip, building a war out of ambiguity. It started with a line on a map that refused to sit still. Texans said their border reached the Rio Grande, south and sweeping. Mexico said the Niños was the line, shorter and safer. Between them lay a no-man's land the width of a small country, dotted with ranchos, thornbrush and rumors. Laws existed there, but they didn't bite. Polk saw the ambiguity and made it useful. Quiet orders moved General Zachary Taylor's army south, past the Niños, toward the Rio Grande. He told Congress he was protecting customs duties and defending Texas. On the ground, Taylor's men dug in on the riverbank opposite Matamoros and raised earthworks they called Fort Texas. Across the water, Mexican gunners watched, counting barrels and tents, and sent couriers racing inland. Stakes landed hard on both capitals. If Mexico ignored the incursion, it looked weak. If it responded, it risked giving Polk exactly what he needed, a shot he could call aggression. Meanwhile, American newspapers warmed the public with tales of insult and injured pride. American blood on American soil was still a phrase waiting for blood. Taylor's patrols fanned into the scrub, recon parties drawing maps, testing crossings, and skirting ranch houses that had flown Mexican flags a week earlier. From Mexico's point of view, these were foreign troops operating inside their border. From Washington's point of view, it was administrative housekeeping. That was the trap. April 25, 1846. Captain Seth Thornton led 63 dragoons north of the Rio Grande, past the chaparral into a corrugated wash where hoofprints told an old story, scouts shadowing, riders circling. Mexican lancers hit fast, driving the patrol into a cul-de-sac of mesquite and mud. The fight lasted minutes. 16 Americans were killed. Thornton was captured. The rest scattered or fell. News rode harder than the cavalry. By the time the dispatch reached Washington, Polk had a message ready. He told Congress that Mexico had invaded our territory and shed American blood upon American soil. He didn't mention the map that could place that soil on either side of a shifting boundary. The ambiguity did the work. Votes followed. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Mexican commanders at Matamoros faced a brutal equation. Do nothing, and Taylor's fort becomes a permanent thumb on the Rio Grande. Fire the first salvo, and the United States calls it war. They chose to act. Batteries across the river opened on Fort Texas. Taylor marched north, met Mexican forces at Palo Alto, and the wider war pulled itself upright. But to understand why that first shot mattered so much, we need to sit in the rooms where the orders were written. Polk had built his presidency on expansion. He settled Oregon at 49, a compromise with Britain that avoided a fight. That left the Southern Theater. California's harbors tempted merchants and admirals. New Mexico's corridors promised routes to the Pacific. None of that could be sold as naked conquest. It needed a narrative. The disputed strip provided it. Call the Rio Grande the border, and every Mexican patrol north of it becomes an invader. Call the Niños the border, and Taylor's entire army is trespassing. In that gray zone, whoever framed the story first won the politics. Polk framed it. On the riverbank, the ground told a simpler story. Soldiers boiled muddy water, chewed hardtack that broke teeth, and watched smoke plumes from Matamoros drift like warnings. Local families packed carts, driven not by manifest destiny, but by the price of staying between two armies. Ranchers tried to hide cattle from requisition. Priests heard confessions from men who'd never seen a cannon fired in anger. The ambiguity wasn't just legal, it was human. A Tejano might have a cousin in Matamoros and a tax receipt from Austin. A mail pouch could carry letters stamped by 2 governments within a week. Flags didn't change the weather, but they changed who came to your door at night. This was the moment everything changed because it proved a theory. Engineer proximity, compress time, and let pride light the fuse. Taylor's slow march south had moved faster than diplomacy. By the time Mexico City's protests found their way through embassies and ministries, there were trenches on the Rio Grande and patrols probing Arroyo's miles inland. Communication lag turned law into rumor. Ulysses Grant, a young lieutenant then, would later write that American forces had been sent to provoke a fight. He wasn't alone in that assessment, but during those opening weeks, the officers kept their opinions to their journals. The machine was already turning. Congress declared war. Volunteers poured south. The disputed strip was no longer a buffer, it was a springboard. In the aftermath, people tried to fix blame on a compass point. Was the Rio Grande the border? The maps disagreed. Treaties signed under duress after San Jacinto gave Texans a claim Mexico refused. Spanish colonial records favored the Niños. None of that mattered once guns spoke. Borders become real when enough men die on the right side of them. Here's where it gets clear. The Thornton Affair wasn't decisive for its casualties. It was decisive for its phrasing. It gave Polk the sentence he needed. It gave newspapers the headline they could sell. And it gave the United States moral camouflage for a campaign that would run from the Gulf to the Pacific. While cannon smoke thinned over Fort Texas, plans already shifted west. The Rio Grande had served its purpose. The next prize lay along a colder coast, where a deep natural harbor waited for a flag that hadn't arrived yet. Military mismatch. Industrial fire meets pre-industrial courage. Palo Alto wrote it in smoke. American guns reached farther, hit faster, and didn't miss after the 3rd round. Mexican smoothbores thundered and fell short. Lines that looked solid at noon were torn open by evening. The lesson wasn't courage, it was calibration. Here's the math behind it. American flying artillery, horse-drawn, drilled like clockwork, could unlimber, fire, and move before Mexican crews finished swabbing. Standardized shot, rifled pieces coming into service, and trained gunners turned fields into geometry. On both sides, men stood up straight under fire. Only one side fought with a factory behind it. Logistics decided who ate, who marched, and who arrived with dry powder. Quartermasters in blue sent manifests down riverboats, across depots, into wagons that actually showed. Boxes fit muskets because factories cut to pattern, not guesswork. Leather harnesses didn't snap because someone had inspected them against a spec. Meanwhile, Mexican supply ran on personal promises, regional rivalries, and roads that became mud every time the sky darkened. Bravery can't fill an empty cartridge box. Politics bled into packed trains. Since independence, Mexico had flipped governments like pages, dozens of changes in 3 decades. Each new cabinet meant new officers, reissued orders, a different plan for the same frontier. Procurement lagged. Pay stalled. Units loyal to different patrons eyed each other while the enemy marched. You can't build doctrine if the instructor changes every month. Training split the war in 2. West Point turned out engineers who thought with shovels as much as swords. They measured gradients, traced lines of fire, and read terrain like a manual. Ad hoc commands on the Mexican side were built to police provinces, chase uprisings, and keep peace among civilians. That's a different skill set from facing methodical siege work and coordinated artillery. Communication killed as surely as cannon. From Mexico City to the northern frontier took weeks by courier. News aged on the road. A general could win a skirmish that the capital didn't know existed, then lose the campaign to a rumor. Americans moved faster than the letters describing them. By the time orders told a garrison to hold, the garrison was already gone. At Palo Alto, the air smelled of sulfur and grass fire. Mexican cavalry, skilled riders, veterans of civil wars, launched, reformed, launched again, looking for a seam. They found smoke screens and round shot skidding low through horses' legs. Taylor's batteries pivoted as if on rails, crossfiring until pressure broke. It wasn't heroism failing, it was velocity and range winning. Resaca de la Palma told the same story at knife range. Americans pushed through palm thickets with bayonets while dragoon sabers flashed on the road. Mexican units fought hard, then ran out of room, then ran out of ammunition. Retreat lanes jammed. Commanders tried to reform under grape. The pattern repeated: contact, disruption, collapse. Meanwhile, something else was happening beyond the battlefield. The American system replaced losses. Contracts issued in New Orleans ended up as rations in camp within weeks. Replacement parts met damaged caissons with bolts that fit. Mexico's economy: silver mines ruined after the Independence War, treasuries thin, couldn't fund a sustained industrial response. Donations and levies bought muskets. They didn't buy time. Disease did its own accounting. American camps killed Americans more efficiently than Mexican muskets did. Yellow fever, dysentery, cholera, names whispered in tents at night. Took 10 for every one shot on some rosters. But the industrial pipeline kept new regiments coming. Mexican soldiers died of the same camps, with fewer surgeons, fewer supplies, and less rest between marches. A war of attrition is won by whoever can afford the attrition. Individual valor never went missing. Mexican infantry held breastworks at Monterrey house by house, forcing street fights stairwell by stairwell. American officers, some barely older than their lieutenants, learned how to turn a fortified corner into a geometry problem. Knock a hole with guns, send engineers to mark lanes, pour in infantry behind a measured curtain of fire. Once you see it, you can replicate it in the next town and the next. Doctrine hardened with each victory. American commanders learned to combine engineers, artillery, and infantry into one moving organism. They cut roads where none existed, built bridges overnight, and set batteries where horses seemed unlikely to climb. Mexican plans had to adapt to a moving enemy with a synchronized clock and interchangeable parts. That's not a fair fight. The distance from superiority to inevitability is discipline. American quartermasters counted nails. Mexican conscripts counted hours since their last meal. When storms came, one force issued ponchos and secured powder. The other prayed for sun and tried to keep flint dry. You can't bayonet rain, but you can plan through it. Grant would later write that the war was unjust. He also admitted what the ledger showed. An army trained by engineers and fed by factories beats an army trained by necessity and fed by politics. Meanwhile, the real prize wasn't on this prairie. It waited beyond mountain passes and cold harbors, where a navy could reach faster than any courier could warn. California, the $3.6 trillion prize hiding in plain sight. While guns spoke on the Rio Grande, eyes in Washington kept drifting west. Not to deserts or missions, but to water, cold, deep water shaped like a promise. San Francisco Bay could swallow a navy and still leave room for merchants to anchor by the dozen. That wasn't poetry, it was leverage. A harbor-like that turns an Atlantic republic into a two-ocean power. On the ground, Mexican presence in California was thin, presidios stretched, missions secularized, authority more suggestion than system. California ranch sprawled for miles, cattle turning into hides and tallow, ships taking on cargo and leaving silver. Population sat in the low thousands under flag that felt far away. The distance from Mexico City wasn't just miles, it was attention. Meanwhile, something else was happening offshore. British frigates paid polite visits, merchants opened tabs, and admirals drew mental maps. If London found a foothold, Pacific trade could tilt without a shot fired. That urgency traveled across Washington desks faster than a courier in Sonora ever could. California wasn't an afterthought, it was the plan. American settlers didn't wait for orders. Trappers turned traders, traders turned landowners, and marriages tied families across language lines. The bear flag moment captured the mood. June 1846, a handful of settlers took Sonoma, sketched a flag with a star and a bear, and declared a republic that lasted less than a month. It looked amateur because it was. It also revealed a truth. Mexican governance in California worked until someone tested it. Then the Navy arrived. Commodore John D. Sloat sailed into Monterey and raised a different banner. To the south, Stockton and Fremont stitched military presence to local ambition. Skirmishes flickered, Lowe's Angels taken, lost, retaken. But the outcome was never about numbers on a battlefield. It was about ships in harbors and who controlled the customs house when the next brigantine arrived from Canton. Here's where it gets uncomfortable for hindsight. In January 1848, at a sawmill on the American River, workers noticed flakes in the tail race. 9 days later, diplomats put signatures to parchment in Mexico. Gold didn't start the war. It made the stakes look clairvoyant. Within a year, ships jammed San Francisco's coves, crews deserting at anchor to scramble inland. A town of a few hundred blew past 25,000. By 1850, California skipped territorial adolescence and walked straight into statehood. But the gold rush is the loud story. The quiet story is geography. The Central Valley runs like a conveyor belt, snowmelt down the Sierras feeding soil so rich it becomes a national pantry. Rivers bend toward ports. Hills cradle microclimates that, a century later, nurture orchards and vineyards with global reach. You don't need foresight to see a port. You need patience to see an ecosystem. American planners had both. Naval surveys had already charted anchorages. Officers could point to where a dry dock should go, where coastal batteries would command the Golden Gate, where lighthouses would turn fog into guidance. California wasn't merely a prize. It was a grid waiting for investment. The war just cleared the paperwork. Population changed the math faster than any ledger. In 1848, California families could count neighbors by name. By 1852, strangers rented rooms in their outbuildings and paid in gold dust. Courts shifted to English. Land titles written in Spanish, and sometimes in memory more than ink, were forced into an American process that measured boundaries in chains, not landmarks. The treaty promised protection. The Land Act demanded proof. While cases ground on, speculators consolidated. Even so, the Pacific delivered its momentum. Direct routes to China and Japan bypassed old intermediaries. Goods sailed out. Hides, then gold, then grain and lumber, then machine parts, then ideas. Steam replaced sail, rail met dock, and a continental railroad made the bay the western hinge of an eastern machine. What started as a military occupation became supply chains welded to geography. Meanwhile, British caution turned to acceptance. No point contesting a coastline already garrisoned and booming. The Royal Navy could visit. It wouldn't stay. That settled one question and opened 100 more about tariffs, immigration, and who got to profit when ships lined up from Yokohama to Yerba Buena. The human layer is what anchors it. California vaqueros taught newcomers how to ride country that broke eastern horses. Chinese miners staked claims and built businesses when fields turned to stores. Indigenous communities bore the sharpest edge: displacement, violence, disease, costs that don't show in GDP charts but live in cemeteries and erased villages. Prosperity had a shadow. It still does. By the 2020s, California's output rivals entire nations. Tech hums in glass boxes south of the bay, ports lift containers like clockwork, fields in the valley feed a continent, and film money flows like a second river to the sea. The people, nearly 40 million, are the gravity. Capital follows, infrastructure deepens, and advantage compounds. Back in the 1840s, none of this wore numbers, only instincts. Secure the bay, hold the coast, populate the valleys, connect the ocean to the continent. That's the blueprint Polk's war delivered, even if he didn't live to see the skyscrapers. The guns quieted, the ships kept coming, and California, thinly held, loosely governed, breathtakingly accessible, became the engine that justified every risk taken to seize it. Santa Anna's gamble. A deal, a betrayal, a retreat. Unknown to most Americans cheering the early victories, a door had quietly opened in Havana. Santa Anna, exiled, calculating, and still the most recognizable face in Mexican politics, sent word to Washington, "Help me get home, and I'll end this on your terms." Polk didn't trust him. He didn't have to. All he needed was a shortcut. The Navy received discreet instructions: let the general pass. He landed at Veracruz like a man reborn, swearing to negotiate, then flipping the script before the sand dried on his boots. Within weeks, he raised 20,000 men out of the central states, fresher, better supplied than the frontier garrisons that had buckled. He promised the nation a reversal. He promised himself power. The two promises didn't point to the same map. From his perspective, the bargain with Polk had already served its purpose. Cooperation in Excel is theater. Legitimacy in Mexico City requires a different act. Any leader who traded land for peace would fall to a bullet or a mob. Santa Anna had survived too long to mistake survival for principle. He would fight. Meanwhile, something else was happening inside his headquarters. Politics walking in formation beside tactics. He needed a victory dramatic enough to cement his return and quiet rivals, but not so costly it bled his core supporters in the center. That's a hard line to walk in a war where the other side fights with factories and ships. February 1847, the high desert near Buena Vista. Tailored forces, outnumbered, dug into broken ground, watched dust plumes rise on the horizon like advancing weather. Santa Anna's plan looked sound. Pressure the American flanks, roll their line, crush the center. For hours, it nearly worked. Mexican infantry surged through gullies, cavalry threatened to wrap around, and American positions bent until officers swore they could feel boards creak under their boots. This was the moment everything could have changed. But on the ridges where decisions live, calculation crept in. Santa Anna measured casualties against careers. Could he risk the central regiments, the men whose families mattered in the capital, for a total victory over Taylor that might still leave Winfield Scott marching from Veracruz? He hesitated, then pulled back. The Americans held. The window closed. Grant, who fought there, later called it a narrow escape. Taylor became a hero. Santa Anna kept his army mostly. In the short run, that preserved his political capital. In the long run, it fractured Mexico's defense. The Northern Theater read the retreat as verdict. You can't beat them out here. Garrisons fell back. Morale thinned like smoke. Santa Anna moved south to confront the bigger threat. The amphibious Hammerscott was lifting at Veracruz. Here again, politics shadowed logistics. He demanded loyalty pledges, shuffled commanders, tested allies for signs of ambition. He fought the enemy in front and the rivals behind. The staff work of a civil war doesn't pause for a foreign invasion. At Cerro Gordo, he chose a pass he considered strong, steep slopes, anchored guns, a road bottleneck choking any advance. It should have forced a frontal meat grinder. Instead, American engineers found a goat path and dragged artillery over rock at night. When dawn came, the flanks evaporated. Mexican units fought, then unraveled as fire arrived from unexpected angles. The retreat became a scramble. Cannon lay abandoned on the road like punctuation marks in a panic letter. This wasn't just tactical failure, it was reputational. Officers who pledged to stand with him watched positions labeled secure collapse in hours. Confidence, already a scarce resource, drained from the command. Meanwhile, civilians along the route saw foreign uniforms in their markets and requisition chits on their doors. The government's grip felt abstract. Authority bleeds fastest in the heartland. Back in the capital, whispers hardened into hesitation. Regional commanders delayed, awaiting instructions. Allies asked for guarantees Santa Anna couldn't honestly give. A pattern set in, bold plan, strong opening, sudden conservation of forces to protect the center, loss of ground, plea for unity. It kept him alive. It didn't keep Mexico intact. His defenders argue he had no real choice. How do you expend the army that props up your regime to save territory that might topple you anyway? His critics answer that the country needed a general and got a politician. The truth sits between. He was both, and in this war that made him neither effective nor trusted. Meanwhile, Scott closed in, carving a corridor from Veracruz to Mexico City with engineers, artillery, and patience. Santa Anna tried to trade space for time, then found time worked for the invader. Each week, American columns moved, supply arrived, and Mexican options shrank. The calculus that had preserved the Central Army now threatened the capital it was meant to protect. In the end, the gamble that began in Havana paid out in reverse. Polk got his war without a partner. Santa Anna got his power without the means to use it. Buena Vista became the emblem. Hours from routing Taylor, then backing off to preserve forces that would be scattered at Cerro Gordo and broken at the gates of Mexico City. The cost wasn't just lost battles, it was credibility. Commanders doubted orders, civilians doubted the state, foreign diplomats doubted Mexico's staying power. Reliability, always fragile, snapped. While Mexico watched the north, the east opened like a door. Scott's impossible march, cutting the lifeline on purpose. While Mexico watched the north, the east opened like a door. On March 9, 1847, surf boats bumped through the Gulf shallows and spilled blue-coated infantry onto the sand south of Veracruz. Within hours, 10,000 men stood in formation, the largest amphibious landing the world would see until the next century. The city bristled with guns. Scott didn't storm it, he ringed it. Siege lines crept forward like careful handwriting. American mortars lobbed shells over the walls. The Navy's big guns stayed outside the reefs. Inside, civilians hid in cellars while shrapnel chewed masonry and courtyards. After weeks of bombardment and negotiation, Veracruz surrendered on March 29. The US flag rose over the gateway, and with it, a choice that broke doctrine. Scott didn't build a supply line back to the sea. He cut it on purpose. Conventional wisdom said secure your base, guard your wagons, inch forward with depots behind you. Scott chose speed over safety and told his men to live off central Mexico. It sounded reckless because it was, unless you could move faster than resistance and pay for corn instead of stealing it. His provosts enforced receipts. His columns marched lean. The risk bought momentum. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the hills ahead. Santa Anna had rebuilt, blocking the road at Cerro Gordo, a mountain pass strung with guns. It looked like a locked gate. Scott sent Robert E. Lee and a team of engineers into the dark to find a key. They traced a goat track up ridges most soldiers would call cliffs, then hauled artillery by rope and swept to a perch behind Mexican lines. Dawn cracked open the pass. Scott's main force hit from the front, drawing fire. Minutes later, guns barked from the improbable heights on the flank. Mexican units pivoted toward the new threat and exposed their backs to the road. Panic outran courage. Cannon tumbled into ravines. Soldiers dropped packs to run. By sunset, the gate was open and Santa Anna's army was in pieces. This was the moment everything changed because it showed how Scott intended to win. Engineers first, artillery placed with malice and math, infantry moving through gaps created on purpose. He wasn't hunting glory in headlong charges. He was breaking systems, communications, supply, confidence. Villages along the national road learned the new routine. Blue columns arrived, posted guards at wells, paid for flour with vouchers, and moved on before rumors could become ambush. Psychologically, it cut deeper than a sack. Foreign uniforms marched through places where the empire had once processed tribute. Now they bought chickens and demanded maps. Authority felt reversed. Scott's staff turned the campaign into choreography. Topographical engineers sketched every bridge and bluff. Quartermasters counted days of hardtack against miles of road. Medical officers set up field hospitals inside churches, scrubbing pews for operating tables. The machine ran with a human cost. Disease still shadowed the march, but it ran. At Puebla, the second city, the gates opened after negotiation rather than assault. That mattered. It reinforced the message that resistance led to rubble, cooperation to receipts and relative calm. Meanwhile, the capital watched its lifelines kink and fray. Prices rose. Couriers arrived late or not at all. The rumor that Scott had no supply line cut both ways, audacious, but also brittle. Hit him once and he might starve, yet no one hit him hard enough. Cutting the lifeline forced discipline. Foragers who stole were flogged. Officers who looked away were replaced. Scott knew an army feeding itself from hostile countryside can rot into a mob. He kept it a military and made it a mirror. Act like occupiers, not raiders. Promise payment, punish abuse. Civilians didn't love it. They feared it less than a sack. Approaching Mexico City, the landscape turned volcanic. Lava beds twisted into black waves called the Pedregal, canals lacing the southern approaches, causeways leading to fortified gates. The obvious roads were watched and walled. Scott refused the obvious. Engineers marked a path across the Pedregal that locals swore was impassable to wield guns. The army crawled it in a day. Meanwhile, something else cracked: the math inside Mexico's high command. Positions labeled secure fell to flanking moves that felt like magic tricks. Each success taught American officers that terrain problems were engineering puzzles with solutions. Each loss taught Mexican commanders that no prepared line could be assumed safe. That erosion of confidence matters more than any battery. At Contreras and Churubusco, the pattern repeated. Night movement, surprise fires, coordinated assault. At Churubusco's convent-turned fort, defenders fought until water in the moat ran red and ammunition ran dry. Then the line bent, then broke. On the causeways, American guns swept lanes like scythes. The city's bells tolled over smoke. The genius of the march wasn't just the path, it was the pressure. By living off the land, Scott removed the slow-tail enemy's attack. By trusting engineers, he turned impassable into "we're late." By paying, he reduced the guerrilla bite that could have shredded a foraging army. And by appearing at the capital's doorstep in months, he made the war field decided before politicians could regroup. Signals to Mexico City were now simple: the capital is next. Nothing has stopped them yet. Chapultepec, teenagers, a flag, and the fall of a capital. Dawn over Mexico City came with the sound of guns. South and west of the city, Scott's columns had cracked the outer ring at Contreras and Churubusco. Now the last high keyhole, Chapultepec, stood on a wooded hill, a fortress and a school in one. Inside its thick walls, Mexico's military academy trained officers. In September 1847, it housed regulars, artillery, and cadets who'd been told to evacuate. Many refused. From the causeways, the hill looked steep and calm, a stone island above fields and canals. It was. Engineers paced distances, flagged battery sites, and marked approach lanes through groves and gardens. Scott chose bombardment first. On September 12, American guns began to thump at measured intervals, shells rising slow and landing inside courtyards, ripping tiles and timber, shocking classrooms into barracks. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the city below. Church bells mixed with the percussion, families fled with bundles, and rumors outran reality. Some said the foreigners would storm at night. Others said the fortress was already fallen. The truth sat on that hill, where officers argued over staying or withdrawing, and teenagers argued they were staying. At sunrise on the 13th, ladders went forward. Chosen storming parties, voltigeurs and light companies, moved under covering fire, the air full of dust and lime. Grapeshot tore gaps. Sharpshooters traded shots through trees. On the slope, cadets in blue and white stood at parapets beside veterans whose faces already held the lines of too many campaigns. They loaded, fired, and loaded again, buying seconds with bodies. This was the moment everything changed, because it compressed the whole war into a single climb. Engineers had made the breach, artillery had softened the stone, and human will try to hold what math said would fall. Ladders hit walls. Hands found purchase. The first assault stalls, then a second crest, then a third. Inside, room by room fighting turned classrooms into choke points and stairwells into traps. The story Mexico kept became 6 names: the Niños, Héroes. Cadets who refused to retreat, chose to fight to the last cartridge. When ammunition ran out, they fought with bayonets and the weight of their bodies. One of them, Juan Escutia, became the symbol. The account says he wrapped himself in the flag and leaped rather than let it be taken. Whether the details match every witness doesn't change the meaning Mexico drew from it. The banner didn't descend in surrender, it fell with a defender. Flags mattered on the roof, but decisions happened in the smoke. American units forced the gates after breaching shots shattered doors. Mexican officers tried to rally men into lines that no longer existed. Cadets were pulled back by teachers who had taught them algebra and now begged them to live. Many didn't. When fire slackened, the hill belonged to the invader, and the city's last guard fell quiet. Down the causeways, the National Palace felt closer with every step. Civilians watched blue ranks move with deliberate cadence. Some shuttered windows, some shouted curses. A few offered water to men who had crossed the Pedregal and climbed a fortress in 2 days. The psychology cut deep. Foreign troops in the capital is an argument no speech can answer. Meanwhile, something else shifted inside American ranks. The victory felt clinical: engineers, artillery, assault, secure. Yet the sight of teenagers among the dead undercut triumph. Soldiers who had killed men with whiskers now stepped past boys wearing academy belts. Even for veterans, that image sticks. For Mexico, it hardened into national memory. Honor intact, territory lost. Occupation followed quickly. Scott's staff posted guards at key ministries, set curfews, and tried to prevent the sack that often follows a stormed city. There were still street fights, snipers on rooftops, and pockets of resistance around garritas, the gatehouses that guarded causeways. But the governmental heart stopped beating. Negotiators would take over from generals because there was no army left to bargain with. The impact rippled. For Mexico, Chapultepec became a scar that taught a lesson they could live with. Bravery survives defeat. The Niños heroes entered textbooks and plazas, giving a conquered generation a story to hand their children that wasn't only loss. For the United States, the fortress became a line on a resume for officers whose careers would matter later. Grant saw siege math work. Lee saw a night trail open a pass. Others saw how disciplined violence takes capitals. In the aftermath, funerals and proclamations shared the same streets. Bells tolled for cadets. Drums beat for parades that announced order under occupation. The flag on the palace said the war was functionally over. But in households that had sent sons to the hill, the war was not numbers and treaties. It was a bedroom left neat and a uniform folded without its wearer. Chapultepec's fall wasn't the biggest battle. It was the clearest ending. A capital taken, a government scattered, a nation forced to the table. And on a rooftop, a flag became a story strong enough to outlast the cannon that pulled it down. The $15 million fig leaf. How America bought legitimacy. Guns fell silent, pens came out. After the palace, the battlefield moved to a table where parchment could turn conquest into policy. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo promised to end the bleeding with clauses that sounded generous and a payment meant to look like fairness. $15 million, plus assuming American claims, another $3.25, framed as compensation, not confession. On paper, the treaty read like a guarantee. Articles VIII and IX pledged that property would be inviolably respected, religion unhindered, language unpunished, and citizenship a choice rather than a verdict. For roughly 3 cents an acre, the United States presented itself as a buyer, not a taker. That phrasing mattered more than the money. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the galleries of Congress. Northern critics of the war had called it aggression in whispers and editorials. The payment gave them cover. If the nation purchased the land, even from a defeated neighbor, they could sell it at town halls as an extension of commerce rather than a triumph of might. Domestic optics counted. Moral arithmetic was being edited in real time. Mexico's side of the ledger looked different. The treasury was a crater. Foreign creditors knocked with ledgers and threats. Army payrolls were in arrears. Provincial governments were already improvising budgets out of requisitions and hope. 15 million meant weeks of wages, months of routine, a chance to keep the lights on while political aftershocks rattled the capital. Dignity costs more than solvency when your currency is collapse. This was the moment everything changed because it set the precedent. Wrap conquest in a receipt. The payment was a fig leaf, large enough to cover what needed covering, small enough not to hide what everyone knew. Diplomats could point to Article XII, to the checks, to the assumption of American citizens' claims, and say the exchange had mutual consent. The cannon's smoke in the margins told a different truth. But treaties live and die in courtrooms, not salons. In California, the promise to respect property met the California Land Act of 1851. That law flipped burdens like a coin. Mexican-era titles had to be proved, translated, surveyed, defended, before a commission that spoke English, demanded American documentary forms, and waited out families who paid lawyers with acres. Rights on parchment became fees at a desk. Technicalities turned into tools. What counted as a boundary when your deed said, "To the oak by the creek that runs in flood," and the new surveyor wanted chains and bearings. Witnesses aged and died. Papers went missing. While claims crawled through years, often more than a decade, tax bills arrived on schedule. Many sold land to pay to defend the land and lost both, the parcel and the money. Meanwhile, something else was happening in Washington's mirrors. The treaty's language, protection of religion, language, property, remained intact in speeches and reports. In counties and state houses, practice shifted. English became the language of proceedings. Voting rights narrowed. Civil offices moved behind qualifications that few Mexican residents could meet quickly. Compliance lived on paper, confiscation lived in practice. Speculators learned the rhythm. Buy a claim cheap from a family exhausted by filings, hire surveyors who knew the game, wait for the commission's stamp, subdivide and sell. Railroads arrived like new gods, blessed by charters that sliced ranchos into gridlines and town lots. Courts upheld the paperwork as law and called the outcome order. The price math stayed absurd. 3 cents an acre for territory that would funnel gold, oil, copper, citrus, water, and wind into an economy that grew into the global ledger's upper lines. California alone, within living memory of the treaty, spun out wealth that dwarfed the original check by orders that defy analogy. But the return on investment wasn't only minerals and ports. It was legitimacy purchased at discount. Domestic peace needed the fiction. The North could tell itself it hadn't endorsed raw theft. The South could tell itself it had expanded the map within norms. Moderates could look away from the means and admire the results. Abroad, the fig leaf signaled that the United States would pay even when it had taken. That pattern would travel. Moral language up front, money on the table, force in the wings. For Mexico, the treaty's bite didn't end at the borderline. Communities saw their legal world translated and trimmed. A notary's flourish in Spanish became a question mark in English. Priests who'd blessed marriages found their records discounted. The cultural promise, keep your faith, keep your schools, ran up against budgets and ballots that flowed the other direction. Protection became persuasion, then pressure. Still, the treaty mattered. Without it, occupation might have festered into insurgency with no exit. With it, withdrawal had a timetable and boundaries a map could teach. The bitterness hardened into law. The anger found dates and articles to cite. A wound with paperwork scars differently than a wound without it. Precedent and pattern, provoke, win, pay, claim legitimacy. The $15 million didn't cleanse the war. It laundered it for domestic use and future policy. In classrooms, the word session replaced seizure. In ledgers, compensation replaced consequence. In the borderlands, families learned that signatures can move mountains the way artillery cannot, quietly, permanently. On parchment, rights were secured. In courtrooms, they were sorted. In fields, they were fenced. The fig leaf did its job. It let a republic that prided itself on law tell itself a story it could live with, even as the people living under the new law learned how quickly promises curdle when they meet power. Legal dispossession, the Land Commission trap. On paper, the treaty had promised certainty. In court, certainty turned into process. California's new statehood brought the California Land Act of 1851, 3 pages that flipped the world. Each and every person claiming lands in California by virtue of any right or title derived from the Spanish or Mexican government shall present the same. The burden moved. The clock started. Stakes were immediate. Miss the filing window and your rancher, your pasture, your wells, your family grave became public domain by default. File on time and you entered a maze. Claims had to be translated from 19th century Spanish formulas into American legalese. Boundaries described by arroyos, oaks, and seasonal creeks had to be converted into bearings and chains. Surveyors arrived with compasses and contracts. Their lines, not the old landmarks, would decide where your cattle grazed and where your fences suddenly trespassed. Action unfolded in rooms far from the fields. The Board of Land Commissioners heard cases in San Francisco. Families from Los Angeles, Monterey, and the Central Valley packed trunks, hired interpreters, and traveled for days to stand before men who'd never ridden their boundaries. Fees began to stack. Lawyers on retainer, translators by the page, surveys billed by the mile, Witnesses lodged for weeks. The hearings moved slowly, the bills didn't. Impact landed like a quiet foreclosure. Proceedings took years, sometimes more than a decade, and appeals climbed into federal courts. While the case crawled, county tax assessors treated land as if ownership were already settled. Taxes came due in cash. Many rancheros sold pieces of their ranchos to pay attorneys defending the rest. Some sold the best water first because it brought the highest price and crippled what remained. By the time the commission confirmed a title, the land around it had been carved away. Meanwhile, something else was happening out on the range. The gold rush had turned paths into roads and roads into corridors of speculation. Squatters arrived with wagons and arguments. "Vacant land," they said, waving the US statutes that didn't mention your grandfather's grant. Sheriffs hesitated. Judges issued injunctions that took months to enforce. Fences went up at night. With every delay, possession shifted from paper to whoever could harvest first and hire more men. Technicalities became weapons. Was the original grant perfected? Did a local alcalde have authority? Was the diseño, a hand-drawn map, sufficient evidence? An oak that anchored a corner had burned. A creek that once ran year-round dried after upstream diversions. Surveyors adjusted lines to match what could be measured today, not what had been granted decades earlier. Chain of title, a simple idea, became a ladder you could fall from at any rung. In micro-stories, the loss is personal. A widow from Santa Barbara, dressed in black since the last fever season, clutched a leather folder of family papers. A clerk told her to return with certified translations. She sold silver candlesticks to hire the translator, returned, and learned the commission needed a new survey. By harvest, her tenant had moved a fence. By winter, she took an offer from a man whose boots never saw mud, enough to cancel debts, not enough to buy back time. The impact rippled past families. Capital pooled around uncertainty. Speculators specialized. They bought claims for pennies on the dollar, financed court costs, and split winnings after confirmation. Railroads arrived with charters and political gravity. Their right-of-way surveys sliced through contested ranches, fixing lines the courts eventually ratified. Towns sprouted on those rails, grids that ignored the gentle curves of old boundaries and the grazing patterns that had made sense before. Treaty spirit versus letter played out in depositions. Article VII said property would be respected. The commission replied that it was, once properly proved. Respect became a stamp on a decree issued after 17 years of litigation. For many, that stamp landed on a lot a tenth the size of the original grant, hemmed in by new titles and tax liens. Compliance in Washington looked tidy. In the counties, it looked like dispossession with receipts. Meanwhile, language did its own kind of erasure. Proceedings ran in English. Spanish-speaking heirs relied on intermediaries who shaped expectations and skimmed percentages. Court reporters captured testimony with names misspelled, landmarks mistranslated, intent recast. Over time, the record replaced memory. When future disputes arose, judges trusted the record. There were exceptions, families with money, savvy counsel, and alliances that held. Some kept thousands of acres intact, adapted to American markets, and married into newcomers' fortunes. Their success became the story the system pointed to as proof of fairness. But as a pattern, the mechanism worked as designed. Shift proof to the weak, slow the process, and let market forces finish the job the cannon had started. Impact at scale changed the map. Ranchos broke into parcels. Parcels became towns and farms aligned with water rights newly defined under American law. The borderlands, culture stretched to fit, but the land changed hands. Where a single brand once grazed 20,000 head, a dozen owners planted wheat, then orchards, then subdivisions. The ledger balanced for the state. It did not balance for the heirs walking away with deeds to memories. This was the moment everything changed because it taught a durable lesson. You can keep a treaty's promises and still alter reality if you control the forum, the calendar, and the cost. After conquest comes paperwork. After paperwork, possession. And by the time the last claim was confirmed, the borderlands had been translated into another language entirely. Written in casualties and camp dollars, the war then killed by water. Victory looked clean on maps. In camp, it smelled like latrines and boiled canvas. The Mexican-American War didn't just kill with shot and steel. It killed by water. Mosquito water, river water, barrel water turned sour in heat. The ledger tells it plain. Roughly 13,780 American dead, and the vast majority never saw the enemy at the moment they lost their fight. Disease took them in the dark, quietly, efficiently. Stakes were human before they were statistical. A volunteer from Ohio wrote home about river fever, then stopped writing. A Louisiana regiment marched healthy into a coastal bivouac and came out limping, yellowed, eyes dim. Surgeons bled men for cholera because that was the doctrine. They packed wounds with lint, rinsed instruments in buckets used for everything. You can hear the tents at night, the coughs rising like a chorus. Action unfolded in patterns the generals couldn't bombard. Along the Gulf, yellow fever rode mosquitoes into canvas cities. In the highlands, dysentery spread through mess lines where the same hands served stew and shook canteens. Wells ran too close to refuse pits. Quartermasters counted rations. Nobody counted flies. A soldier could survive Palo Alto, Resaca, Monterey, and still die 3 weeks later from water he drank without thinking. Impact was brutal math. For every American killed by enemy fire, many more fell to microbes nobody could name yet. The army filled replacements because factories and farms could spare them. Disease didn't respect those logistics. And Mexican camps suffered the mirror image. Fewer doctors, thinner supply, more stress on bodies already worn by civil war and marches that started with empty stomachs. Civilians caught in the lanes of occupation paid another price entirely. Meanwhile, something else was happening in towns the maps barely marked. Requisition notices looked orderly on paper, receipts for corn, beef, blankets. In practice, an American column arrived, bought what it could, took what it needed, and moved on. A village that could feed itself for a season fed an army for a week. Harvest cycles broke. Children were sent to cousins 2 valleys away. Old people stayed and hoped. This was the moment everything changed, because occupation turned private economies into military supply, and the sickness followed. Crowds at market spread cholera faster than a messenger. Refugees brought fevers into places that had been spared until then. No one tallied Mexican civilian deaths with care. The absence sits heavy. The war that looks like lines and arrows in atlases was hunger and infection in kitchens. Action at the soldier's scale reads like a grim routine. A private fills his canteen from a shallow ditch because the line at the barrel is too long. He doesn't know the regiment upstream washed shirts there. By evening, cramped. By morning, a wagon ride to a church where pews have become beds. The surgeon's hands are steady. His tools are clean as he understands it. The fever doesn't care. Outside, a drummer boy eats hardtack that will not soften. He stares at a letter with a crease that smells like home. Impact travels forward in faces. Grant learned triage in hospitals as much as tactics in fields. Lee watched men collapse from sun and flux and understood what climate does to plans. Sherman saw what a foraging army can do to a countryside even when it pays, and what disease does to morale when it lingers. They carried those lessons into a different war on different fields against men they'd learned beside. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the borderlands the treaty touched before the ink dried. Around 75,000 Mexican residents woke up as foreigners at home. The flag on the courthouse changed. The water in their acequia didn't. But rights promised on parchment ran into county clerks who spoke a different language and neighbors who suddenly had the law's ear. Status limbo isn't a wound you can bandage. It's a slow fever. Stakes for those families weren't abstract. A baptism record had to prove an heir's name. An old alcalde's seal had to stand up in a new courtroom. While adults argued, harvests waited, and irrigation schedules fell apart under new priorities. Water rights, lifelines in dry country, migrated toward the loudest voices and the newest titles. Action persisted in the camps even as peace was negotiated. Men kept dying of the old camp diseases because knowledge lagged. Latrines moved too late. Wells were dug too shallow. Commanders who could choreograph an assault on a volcanic field couldn't choreograph hygiene they didn't yet understand. Impact is the line we rarely read on monuments. Most who died without an enemy in sight. The war taught the army to think about sanitation because it had to. It taught civilians along the route that an army's shadow is longer than its column. And it taught a country that conquest carries bills no ledger can settle, paid in water, in bodies, in names that never made the reports. Slavery's fuse. Mexico will poison us. The ink on the treaty hadn't dried before the next crisis lit. Gold pulled ships west. Politics pulled knives in Washington. The question was blunt. Would slavery march into the land taken from Mexico? Ralph Waldo Emerson's warning hung in the air. Mexico will poison us, and now everyone could taste it. Here's where it starts to combust. In August 1846, while armies were still on the march, Congressman David Wilmot rose with a simple amendment to a funding bill. No slavery in any territory taken from Mexico. The Wilmot Proviso didn't pass, but it did more damage than any cannon. It split parties along sectional lines, not ideology. Northern Democrats rallied beside Whigs. Southern Whigs stood with Democrats. The map of loyalty redrew overnight. Meanwhile, something else was happening inside the halls. The Missouri Compromise line, the old 36 degrees 30 that had kept a lid on things since 182, didn't reach the Pacific. The Mexican cession blew past it, a continent's worth of ambiguity. Where would slavery stop? The South saw new states to protect balance. The North saw a chance to block the spread. Every acre from the Rio Grande to the Sierra turned into a chessboard. California accelerated the clock. Gold made it populous fast, and the Constitution Californians drafted in 1849 banned slavery. That wasn't a moral manifesto. It was a labor calculation. Miners didn't want to compete with enslaved labor or plantation capital. But in the Senate, numbers are power, and one free state without a slave state partner threatened the arithmetic that had kept peace. Southern senators warned that admitting California free would tilt the chamber and strip their veto over the future. This was the moment everything changed, because the victory over Mexico forced the country to decide what it had avoided for decades. Americans could fight abroad without choosing. They couldn't annex half a continent without answering the slavery question. Threats of secession moved from fringe to floor speeches. Nashville hosted a convention where Southern delegates weighed options in public. The Union felt the seam open. Henry Clay walked back into the breach with the Compromise of 1850. The deal ran like this. California entered as a free state. The territories of Utah and New Mexico would decide slavery by popular sovereignty. Let the settlers vote. The slave trade ended in Washington, D.C., but slavery remained legal there. And to appease Southern demands, Congress passed a harsher Fugitive Slave Act. Popular sovereignty sounded fair. It was a trap. It meant every territorial election turned into a national proxy war. It invited armed migrations, men crossing borders to stuff ballot boxes and guard polling places with rifles. It made survey lines into front lines. The principle that locals should choose guaranteed that nobody would accept the result unless they'd controlled the count. The Fugitive Slave Act poured gasoline on northern streets. Federal marshals could seize alleged fugitives without jury trials. Citizens could be compelled to help. It brought slavery into places that had treated it like rumor. Now a Boston dockworker could be ordered to help capture a man who had lived free for years. Judges were paid more if they ruled a person a slave than if they ruled him free. Resistance shifted from speeches to safe houses, committees, and sometimes mobs. The Underground Railroad's routes hardened. Vigilance committees posted lookouts. The law turned moderates into activists. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the plains beyond the session's edge. The logic of popular sovereignty traveled. When Congress organized Kansas and Nebraska in 1854, the Missouri Compromise was repealed to allow the same vote there. The result, bleeding Kansas, showed what let the people decide meant in practice: arson, ambush, and dueling territorial governments. Men who'd learned each other's methods in Mexico now saw how quickly political theory bled on the prairie. The Mexico poison wasn't a metaphor, it was a process. Victory handed the nation territory it couldn't govern without choosing between incompatible futures. The old party system, the one that had argued tariffs and banks, cracked under the weight. New coalitions formed around one idea: whether slave power would expand or stop. The Republican Party rose out of that refusal. In micro-stories, the poison felt like a knock. A marshal in Syracuse hammered a door at dawn, backed by statute and a line of bayonets. A committee of safety gathered in a church basement, passing hats to pay fines and lawyers. A senator from Mississippi wrote home about the inevitability of separation if California sat free without a counterweight. A merchant in Chicago watched sales dip when customers muttered about complicity. Grant's quiet verdict on the Mexican War, unjust, a stronger against a weaker, acquired a second clause in hindsight. The injustice ricocheted. Americans had grabbed a continental prize and brought home a question they could no longer dodge. The Wilmot Proviso failed as law but won as prophecy. The Compromise of 185 postponed crisis while deepening it. Popular sovereignty turned neighbors into combatants. The Fugitive Slave Act trained a generation to defy federal power when conscience demanded. Emerson had called it. Mexico would poison them, not with foreign troops or debts, but with the answer baked into conquest. Decide what kind of nation you are right now on land taken yesterday. The clock that started on the Rio Grande would ring in Charleston Harbor a decade later. The Empire Template, how the 1840s became U.S. foreign policy. The war ended on parchment, but something more durable settled into the bloodstream, a method. Provoke where the map is blurry, wrap force in moral language, move faster than diplomacy can catch you. Pay just enough to call it purchase. Then let logistics make it permanent. That sequence, tested from the Niños to Chapultepec, became muscle memory. Start with the spark. Polk needed Mexico to shoot first. The disputed strip delivered a usable incident. Later, administrations would find their own pretexts. A damaged ship, an insult to honor, a civilizing mission, each packaged for headlines and speeches. The pattern wasn't loud, it was reliable. Create proximity, claim defense, answer with escalation. Meanwhile, something else hardened behind the rhetoric: industry as doctrine. In 1846, quartermasters, engineers, and standardized parts won battles for men who'd never seen a factory floor. The lesson landed in staff colleges and appropriation bills. Railways weren't just commerce, they were mobilization. Telegraph lines weren't just news, they were command and control. The Army and Navy learned to think like warehouse managers with artillery. Moral language gave the method its cover. Polk spoke of defending American soil while marching into a gray zone. Afterward, the treaty's rights clauses let the Republic keep talking about law even as commissions dissolved Mexican titles in court. That pairing, virtue on paper, leverage in practice, traveled well. When later presidents spoke about freeing peoples or spreading order, they reached for the same toolbox. Ideals first, expeditions next, indemnities and contracts last. You can trace the echo. In the 1850s, Southern filibusters eyed Cuba and Central America with private armies wrapped in liberation talk. Washington often disavowed them while borrowing their language. By 1898, the spark was a ship in Havana harbor, headlines printing outrage, and an occupation sold as protection. The moral frame shifted names: civilization, liberty, stability, but the choreography felt familiar. Logistics culture became its own faith. Scott's march cut the lifeline and lived off receipts. Future planners took the hint and built lifelines so thick they became roads. Coal coaling stations, then oil bunkers, forward depots, then global supply chains. Blue water fleets that could appear on distant horizons with repair ships and dry docks in tow. Industry wasn't the back office of empire, it was the front line. Borders took on a new meaning too. The line drawn after 1848 was more than ink, it was a fortified idea. Outposts grew into forts, forts into garrisons, patrols into habit. The boundary became an operating theater: customs, soldiers, rails, later fences and cameras. Militarization wasn't a policy choice every year, it was baked into how the line had been made. Meanwhile, something else persisted: the purchase ritual. $15 million for a moral fig leaf set a template. After taking with one hand, pay with the other. An indemnity, a claims settlement, a lease, a treaty clause. It soothed dissent at home and gave diplomats a paragraph to cite abroad. Even when the numbers were small next to the spoils, the act mattered more than the amount. The doctrine had downsides the architects accepted. Manufactured provocations could misfire. Moral language could overpromise. Logistics could fail under climates and microbes that didn't care about schedules. But the men holding maps believed the math. Industrial capacity plus narrative control equals strategic options. Mexico had proven the equation in weeks that Europe took decades to learn. In micro stories, the template lives in habits. A captain drills his company to entrench by the book because West Point taught him that dirt saves lives. A clerk writes requisitions in duplicate because supply is a weapon. An envoy drafts two versions of a note, one for public consumption, heavy on rights, one for private delivery, heavy on terms. The gears mesh before the first shot. This was the moment everything changed because the United States stopped treating expansion as a frontier accident and started treating it as a system. Provoke, justify, surge, settle, legalize. The actors would change, presidents with different accents, adversaries with different flags, but the script felt set. And every time it worked, it grew harder to imagine a world where it wouldn't. From the perspective of those who lost the ground, the template looked like weather. First a pressure drop, then a storm, then a blue sky owned by someone else. From the perspective of those who wrote the orders, it looked like inevitability. Industry made it possible. Paper made it respectable. Memory made it easy to forget how $11 trillion engine, counting the spoils. 2 centuries after the smoke cleared, the ledger speaks louder than the cannons ever did. On soil taken between 1846 and 1848 live roughly 89 million Americans, nearly a quarter of the country, stacked in cities and valleys that pump out between 1/3 and 2/5 of US GDP. The engine that roars in 2025 runs on ground once stamped with Mexican seals. Start with population because people are gravity. California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and large swathes of Colorado and Wyoming aren't just spaces on a map. They're where votes and venture capital cluster. Congressional seats concentrate there. Federal budgets bend toward their highways, reservoirs, ports, and labs. That political weight locks in the economic weight, and the cycle tightens with every census. Meanwhile, something else is humming along the coasts. Pacific access turned a continental republic into a 2-ocean power, and ports made the difference real. Containers stack at Los Angeles and Long Beach like steel currency, cranes writing a metronome soundtrack across the water. San Pedro Bay alone moves goods measured in trillions across a decade, turning highways into arteries that feed every warehouse district between Riverside and Reno. On the northern edge, Oakland ties agriculture to Asia and semiconductors to supply chains. Ports didn't just open a door, they set the terms of trade. California's internal math looks like a federation of engines. The Bay's software and chips, venture-backed and patent-dense, spin ideas into markets at a pace that keeps lawyers and regulators panting to keep up. Down the coast, Hollywood exports attention the way the Central Valley exports calories. That valley, watered by snow captured on granite spires, fills grocery aisles far from the fields. Tech, film, and food, 3 pillars, all resting on geography the treaty moved with a pen. Texas answers with energy and wind. Fields that once grew cotton now bristle with turbines. West Texas sunsets cut through spinning blades and pump jacks. Oil and gas still bankroll budgets, but grids increasingly hum with electrons caught from planes and sun. Houston speaks the language of refineries and rockets. Austin speaks code. Dallas moves money and goods. The state's internal supply chains, rails, highways, pipelines, act like sinew-tying Gulf ports to desert basins. Arizona and Nevada, once marked desert on eastern imaginations, cash in sunlight and tourists. Phoenix sprawls under air-conditioned ambition, data centers squatting near cheap land and power. Outside Tucson, fabs rise because water rights and incentives set tables that multinationals like to sit at. Nevada rolls dice on visitors and logistics. I-15 moves both chips and chips. Utah and Colorado layer minerals, software, and mountains. Along the Wasatch Front, startups and enterprise firms share cafeteria lines with skiers in hoodies. The state sells itself as predictable and fast. Colorado integrates aerospace and outdoor brands with a university pipeline that feeds labs perched above mile-high air. Underfoot, Copper and rare earths that once drew pickaxes now draw environmental impact statements and new refineries. The Southwest solar potential isn't a brochure, it's a grid map. Utility-scale arrays march across scrubland, inverters singing at noon. Transmission lines creep toward markets that used to scoff at sun's reliability. Lithium brines in the Salton Sea and geothermal steam hint at a future where batteries and baseload share a postal code with earthquake faults and bird sanctuaries. The old extractive economy morphs, the ground still pays. Self-reinforcing gravity explains the rest. People follow jobs, jobs follow infrastructure, infrastructure follows people. Universities attract research dollars, research spins out companies, companies lobby for roads, runways and visas, airports expand, flights connect directly to Asia. Each improvement makes the next one cheaper. The network tightens and the region's pull strengthens. Meanwhile, something else holds it together beneath the headlines. Water. Snowpack is sovereign out here. Law carved river compacts when populations were smaller and glaciers thicker. Today, reservoirs drop like elevator cars in drought years, and cities renegotiate scarcity in committee rooms that feel like war councils. Agriculture adapts. New crops, drip lines, fallowed acres, because it must. Tech campuses plant drought-tolerant landscaping because press releases read better with native grasses. The engine needs coolant. The coolant is finite. The payoff makes the history feel inevitable, but it was. The 184's wager, ports to Asia, interior valleys, mineral belts, energy provinces, matures into a 2025 balance sheet that would stagger the men who signed the treaty. California alone rivals top economies. Texas stands shoulder to shoulder with nations. The rest fill out a portfolio that outperforms continents. Add up port throughput, farm receipts, energy exports, venture capital rounds, federal research grants, and you can see the $11 trillion headline without squinting. Political clout rides alongside. Senators from these states sit on committees that decide rails, chips, and water science. Governors negotiate with foreign ministers over flights and factories like they're running countries. City councils decide warehouse setbacks that ripple into national inflation data. The border, militarized by origin, doubles as a supply chain scene. Trucks queue at crossings where customs algorithms and labor agreements interact like gears. This was the moment everything changed, because the conquest stopped being a story about cavalry and became a story about compounding advantages. Ports begat trade, trade begat people, people begat representation, representation begat funding, funding begat more ports. The cycle looks clean now because its costs have been pushed into memory, treaties parsed into dispossession, rivers split into spreadsheets, cultures translated into zoning codes. 2 centuries on, the engine hums. It throws off heat, inequality, housing pressure, groundwater fights, but it hums. And whether you cheer it or choke on it, the truth sits in the numbers. The wealth and weight of modern America balance on land Mexico once governed and Washington once wanted badly enough to bleed for, pay for, and lawyer into permanence. Memory wars, the forgotten war that built the present. Ask 10 Americans what happened between 1846 and 1848, and half will shrug. Ask 10 Mexicans, and you'll hear a wound with dates. On one side of the border, the war fades behind myth, pioneers, trails, a gold rush poster on a dorm wall. On the other, its foundational trauma, la pérdida, the loss. 2 histories share a map and argue over what it means. Meanwhile, something else was happening in classrooms. For a century, American textbooks called it Destiny, a march of liberty west. Then historians pulled the thread, Polk's provocation, the disputed strip, the fig leaf payment, and the fabric changed. Session sounds voluntary until you read the treaty beside the casualty lists and the court dockets. New editions started using another word, conquest. Mexico never needed the reminder. Public plazas hold statues of the Niños, Héroes. Streets carry names from a defense that failed militarily but lived culturally. Schoolchildren learn the hill and the flag story the way others learned battle hymns. The lesson is clear. Honor can survive defeat, territory can't. That memory shapes policy instincts. Be cautious with neighbors who say they want stability and arrive with engineers. In the borderlands, Memory runs along irrigation ditches and kitchen tables. Land, language, and culture didn't vanish when the line moved. Families still argue water turns by the ditch's bend, not the survey's angle. Spanish persists on storefronts that predate annexation. Church bells mark fiestas layered over older rites. Legal erasure didn't erase the daily rituals that make a place feel like itself. But the American legal memory did its own work. Court records and commission reports replaced oral boundaries with plats. A rancho story shrank to a case caption, and a number of acres confirmed. That paper trail became the authoritative past for judges and title companies. When disputes arose, the archive ruled, even when it missed what neighbors could point to with their hands. Modern policy debates trace back to those choices. Immigration arguments lean on a border drawn by war, then fortified by routine. Trade routes ride rails and roads poured to serve conquest's ports, later called supply chains. Water compacts rest on flows imagined abundant before cities sprawled. When a drought forces cuts, negotiators quote allocations born in a century that didn't count this many straws. Meanwhile, something else lingers in political language. Leaders invoke security at the line that conquest set, then struggle with the people whose grandparents lived north and south long before it hardened. Enforcement is one memory, forts becoming agents, telegraphs becoming censors. Kinship is another, cousins crossing for weddings, remittances flowing back like seasonal rivers. The friction isn't new, it's baked in. Grant's verdict echoes because it threads morality through logistics. He fought the war, won rank by it, then called it unjust. A stronger against a weaker, provoked into firing where the map was grey. That sentence cuts through patriotic fog without cancelling courage in the ranks. It says both things are true. Soldiers did their duty. The cause served appetite. In micro stories, amnesia shows itself plainly. A Silicon Valley engineer eats lunch on a campus 40 miles from where a Californio family once ran cattle. She knows the startup's valuation, not the rancher's name. A West Texas wind tech climbs a turbine on land grid squared after commission ruling. His company knows megawatts, not the grant. A dockworker in Long Beach moves containers under cranes that trace their lineage to a naval survey and a bombardment. He knows shifts and union rules, not why the harbor is American. The memory wars aren't about guilt alone, they're about agency. If conquest built the present, who bears the responsibility to manage its legacies? One answer says let markets work and borders hold. Another says acknowledge the origins, protect cultures that survive the paper cuts, and share water, wealth, and decision-making with the communities that didn't move but changed countries. This was the moment everything changed, because forgetting became a luxury the facts won't allow. The engine runs, and its origin story isn't optional reading anymore. The more the GDP climbs on that soil, the more honest the history has to be. Not to relitigate the treaty, but to govern the future without lying about the past. So the question isn't whether it happened. It's what we do with what we know. Teach it straight. Plan like water is finite. Police a border without erasing the people who live on it. And admit that prosperity often rides in on someone else's loss. Memory won't balance the ledger. It can at least write the next page without euphemism. The engine hums because strategy, disease, and paperwork turned a neighbor's map into America's core. If you want the hidden playbook behind borders, ports, and power, subscribe now. Watch our deep dive on the Oregon line next, the quiet negotiation that set the northern edge while Mexico burned. New episodes every